The war between humanity and the Atriarch Dominion had been over for a year. The ink had dried on the Treaty of Hartal, and although the conflict had officially ended, the tension lingered. On both sides, soldiers were still adjusting to peacetime. Old scars didn't heal overnight, and for many, those scars weren't just physical. For Major Eric Sarnow, who'd spent years on the front lines, adapting to his new role on a neutral station felt almost as challenging as the war itself. Eric leaned against the railing of a wide observation deck, staring out at the endless black. The station orbited the barren moon of Etra, a dull rock in a quiet sector of space. His role here was simple: oversee the human side of supply logistics and make sure nothing went wrong. At least, that was how it was described to him. The reality? It was day after day of monitoring shipment records, signing off on cargo inspections, and navigating the occasional argument among the staff. The station's crew was a mixed lot: humans, Atriarch, and a few others from smaller allied species working together in an uneasy truce. Another exciting shift? Asked Lieutenant James Vaughn, a wiry man with a quick smile and an even quicker wit. He joined Eric on the railing, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee's terrible, by the way, but it's hot." Eric accepted the cup, raising it slightly in thanks. "Is it ever not terrible?" "Good point," Vaughn replied, taking a sip and wincing. "So, what's on your mind, Major? You've been staring at that moon like it's about to give you life advice." Eric gave a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about how quiet it's been. The war's over, we're out here in the middle of nowhere, and yet it doesn't feel over, you know?" Vaughn nodded, leaning on the railing. "Yeah, I get that. Every time I see one of them," he gestured toward the Atriarch side of the station, "I have to remind myself that we're on the same team now. Hard to break old habits." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a pair of supply drones maneuvering containers into the station's cargo bays. Eric's thoughts drifted to the Atriarch officer he'd seen earlier that day, Captain Keela Rin. She had been in the docking bay, efficiently directing her crew. He'd caught her eye for a brief second, and though he hadn't said a word, he'd felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Their history wasn't personal, but it was shared. Humans and Atriarch had spent years trying to obliterate each other. How were they supposed to simply work side by side now? "Hey, Earth to Sarnow," Vaughn said, snapping his fingers. "You want to get dinner before another crisis pops up? Mess hall's serving something that's technically pasta." Eric considered the offer but shook his head. "You go ahead. I'll catch up later." Vaughn gave him a knowing look but didn't press. "Sure. Just don't brood too long, Major. The moon's not going anywhere." He wandered off, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts. Later that evening, Eric made his way to the maintenance bay where routine checks on the station's oxygen systems were underway. As he arrived, he spotted Keela standing by a console, her shimmering skin catching the harsh overhead lights. She was deep in conversation with one of her engineers, her voice calm but commanding. Eric hesitated. He wasn't sure why he lingered, watching her. Maybe it was because she seemed so at ease in a place where he still felt like an outsider. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Captain Rin." She turned, her sharp, alien features betraying no surprise. "Major Sarnow, do you need something? I heard there were issues with the oxygen filtration. I wanted to see if you needed an extra set of hands." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing his sincerity. "We're managing, but you're welcome to observe." Eric stepped closer, glancing at the diagnostic readouts on the console. He could see the problem immediately. One of the flow regulators was off by a fraction. "Mind if I take a look?" Keela gestured to the panel. "Be my guest." As Eric crouched down and began adjusting the controls, Keela crossed her arms and watched. "You're more hands-on than I expected," she said after a moment. "I assumed your rank meant you preferred issuing orders from a distance." Eric glanced up. "We didn't win many battles sitting behind desks. I've always believed in knowing the systems inside and out. Makes it easier to spot problems before they spiral out of control." "That's unusual," she said, her tone neutral. "Among my people, officers are trained to lead, not to tinker." "Well, maybe you'd have won the war if you tinkered more," Eric said, flashing a small, dry grin. Keela's eyes flicked to his, and for a split second, he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. But it was gone just as quickly. "And yet here we are, working together. Strange, isn't it?" Eric said, standing. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "I mean, it's not like we were given a choice, but still, it's strange." Before Keela could respond, a loud hissing sound erupted from one of the vents. Both of them turned as the room's lights flickered. The diagnostic panel flashed red. Eric swore under his breath. "Great! What now?" Keela was already moving. "The backup filtration system must have kicked in. If it's failing, we'll lose oxygen in this section within minutes." Let's fix it before that happens, Eric said, following her to the access panel. He could hear the tension in her voice as she called out commands to her engineer. The situation was escalating and fast. For the next half hour, Eric and Keela worked side by side, barely speaking except to share brief updates. Eric handled the manual controls while Keela input adjustments into the system's mainframe. They moved with an unspoken rhythm, their focus solely on preventing a complete shutdown. When the pressure finally stabilized and the warning lights faded, Eric leaned back against the console, breathing heavily. Well, he said, that was fun. Keela glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You have a strange definition of fun. Guess I'm just not used to peace and quiet yet. He smirked, trying to lighten the mood. You handled that well. I mean it. Her sharp eyes softened slightly. You didn't do so badly yourself, Major. Perhaps we'll get along after all. Eric met her gaze, and this time he was certain he saw it, just the faintest hint of a smile. Days turned into weeks, and the station settled into a tentative routine. The crew had adjusted to the sight of humans and Atriarch working together, at least on the surface. Beneath the thin veneer of professionalism, old grudges still smoldered. Conversations were polite but distant, and trust was a scarce commodity. For Eric and Keela, however, those early collaborations on system repairs had marked a turning point. The forced proximity had done what no treaty could. It had broken the ice. One evening, Eric found himself in the engineering bay, reviewing power consumption reports. He wasn't scheduled for the task, but Vaughn's comment about brooding had stuck in his mind. When Keela appeared in the doorway, he was genuinely surprised. Captain Rin, Eric said, looking up from his tablet. I didn't expect to see you here this late. Keela stepped inside, her presence as composed as ever. I could say the same for you, Major. Working overtime. Something like that, he replied. You here to check on the generator diagnostics? She gave a small nod, her eyes scanning the room. The Atriarch team has concerns about the coolant levels. I wanted to confirm the readings myself. Sounds exciting. Eric smiled slightly, hoping to draw out more than her usual brief answers. Wouldn't you rather be off duty, doing something more relaxing? Keela arched one brow, her expression faintly amused. And what would you suggest I do to relax? I don't know, Eric said with a shrug. Read a book, listen to music, maybe watch one of those old Earth films we've got in the archives. It doesn't have to be all work all the time. And do you take your own advice? She countered, her gaze direct. Well, Eric hesitated, then laughed softly. Fair enough. I guess I don't. I'm here, aren't I? Indeed, Keela said, stepping closer. She examined the control panel near him, her movements fluid and precise. Perhaps humans and Atriarch are not so different after all. We both have a tendency to throw ourselves into tasks when we should be resting. Eric leaned against the console, watching her work. Maybe it's a habit we can both learn to break. They worked side by side for a while, exchanging the occasional comment about the readings. Eric found himself relaxing in her presence, the tension he'd felt at the start of the assignment slowly ebbing away. Keela, for her part, seemed more willing to engage in conversation than she had in the beginning. There was a quiet understanding growing between them, built not on the shared horror of the war, but on the simple act of cooperation. As they finished checking the coolant levels, Eric leaned back and crossed his arms. So, what do you think? Is everything running smoothly? Smoothly enough, Keela replied. Though I'll be keeping a close watch on the flow rates over the next few days. The station's systems are temperamental. Tell me about it, Eric said. Sometimes I feel like this whole place is held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. Keela actually chuckled at that, a soft sound that caught him off guard. I'm not familiar with duct tape, but I assume it's not the ideal foundation for a space station. Not even close, Eric said, grinning. But it's gotten us through worse. If it can hold a ship together in combat, it can handle a cranky coolant system. Her amusement faded into thoughtfulness. You talk about the war easily, as if it doesn't trouble you. Eric's smile faded as well. It troubles me, he said quietly. Every day. But talking about it makes it easier. I can't change what happened, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Keela nodded slowly. A reasonable approach. My people often prefer silence, believing that words can stir old wounds. But perhaps you are right. Perhaps speaking of it can bring understanding. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the station's systems the only sound. Then Eric took a step back, gesturing toward the door. Come on, let's get out of here. I think we've stared at enough coolant flowcharts for one night. To the mess hall? Keela asked, tilting her head. Sure, Eric said. They've got that rehydrated soup again. It's not terrible if you add enough pepper. An appetizing endorsement, Keela said dryly, but she followed him out. In the mess hall, they sat across from each other at a small table. Eric stirred his soup absent-mindedly, while Keela carefully measured out a pinch of pepper from a small packet. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air, a mix of human and atriarch voices that had become surprisingly normal. So, Eric began, breaking the comfortable silence. Have you had a chance to explore the archives yet? There are some old Earth films in there that might surprise you. Not yet, Keela said. I was curious, but I wasn't sure where to start. Earth culture is extensive. That's one way to put it, Eric said with a chuckle. I'd recommend starting with something light. Maybe an old comedy. There's one about a group of scientists in New York dealing with a unique pest problem. It's a classic. Keela raised an eyebrow. A unique pest problem? You'd have to see it to understand, Eric said. Trust me, it's worth it. Very well, she said, her tone neutral, though there was a glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. I'll give it a try. For the next hour, they talked about Earth films, atriarch storytelling traditions, and the differences in their respective art forms. Eric learned that Keela had a surprisingly sharp sense of humor, though it was subtle and often took him a moment to catch. In turn, she seemed to enjoy hearing his stories of growing up on Earth, small, ordinary moments that made her ask questions about human habits and expressions. As they stood to leave, Eric glanced at her. So, maybe next time you can show me something from your archives. I wouldn't mind seeing what atriarch culture is all about. I might take you up on that, Keela said. Though I must warn you, our art is not always lighthearted. I can handle it, Eric said with a smile. Besides, I think we've got more in common than we realized. Keela regarded him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Perhaps we do. As they parted ways for the night, Eric felt a strange sense of ease. For the first time since arriving on the station, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the past alone. Tensions aboard the station never completely disappeared. Humans and atriarch worked together out of necessity, but mistrust lingered. The war may have ended on paper, but its shadow still stretched over every interaction, every shared meal, every passing glance in the corridors. Eric and Keela continued to collaborate on projects, and their conversations grew more frequent, more personal. They didn't just talk about work anymore. Slowly, they began to share fragments of their past lives, pieces of themselves that had nothing to do with battles or treaties. One evening, Eric found himself back in the engineering bay reviewing yet another set of diagnostic reports. He didn't expect company, but the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him told him otherwise. He turned to find Keela standing there, holding a small container in her hands. Evening, Captain, Eric said, setting down his tablet. What brings you here? Keela held up the container, her expression unreadable. I thought you might be interested in something from atriarch cuisine. Consider it a cultural exchange. Eric raised an eyebrow. Cultural exchange, huh? That doesn't sound like a bribe at all. It is not a bribe, Keela said, her voice tinged with amusement. But you have been encouraging me to try human entertainment. I thought it was only fair to share something from my culture in return. Fair enough, Eric said, gesturing toward the nearest console. Let's see what you've got. They sat on the edge of the console, and Keela opened the container to reveal what looked like shimmering blue flakes. Eric leaned in closer, intrigued. So, what is it? He asked. Ikta, she replied. It's a dried fruit from my homeworld. We often eat it as a snack. It's not as heavy as many human foods, but it has a distinct flavor. Eric reached out to take a small pinch of the blue flakes. As he brought it to his mouth, he caught the faintest hint of a smile on Keela's face. The flakes dissolved on his tongue with a taste that was both sweet and slightly tangy, unlike anything he'd ever had before. Wow, he said after a moment. That's actually really good. I'm glad you think so, Keela said. I wasn't sure if human taste buds would appreciate it. They sat there for a while, passing the container back and forth. The atmosphere felt oddly relaxed, and Eric found himself enjoying the moment. He glanced over at Keela, noting the way her features softened when she wasn't deep in work or under the weight of formality. You know, he said, I never thought I'd be sitting here, sharing snacks with someone I was fighting a year ago. Nor did I, Keela admitted. But perhaps that is the purpose of peace. To find new ways to connect, even if it seems unlikely. Eric nodded slowly. It's been a hell of an adjustment. But I think it's getting easier. At least, with some people. Kilo's gaze met his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was a brief, unspoken acknowledgement that things were changing, that their once clear roles as adversaries had blurred into something more complicated. Before the silence could stretch too long, the station's comm system chimed. A voice came over the speakers, sounding more annoyed than urgent. Major Sarnow, Captain Rin, we've got a dispute in the cargo bay. Could use some senior officers down here to sort it out? Eric sighed and pushed himself off the console. Guess break time's over. Shall we? Keela closed the container and followed him out. The cargo bay was buzzing with activity when they arrived. 2 human crew members were arguing loudly with an Atriarch technician. A cluster of onlookers had formed and the tension in the air was palpable. Eric stepped forward, raising his voice enough to cut through the noise. All right, what's going on here? One of the humans, a burly man named Harris, gestured angrily at the Atriarch. She's trying to claim more space than she's allowed. We agreed on the allocations last week, and now she's moving our cargo out of the way to make room for her own shipments. The Atriarch technician, whose name tag read Loren, folded her arms. Your cargo was improperly stored. I moved it to ensure safety protocols were followed. If you want to argue about space, perhaps you should consult the station's guidelines before accusing me of misconduct. Keela stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Loren, did you inform the human crew before making these adjustments? I attempted to, Loren said, but they dismissed my concerns. I took action to prevent a potential hazard. Eric looked at Harris. Is that true? She didn't explain anything. Harris snapped. Just started shoving our containers around like it was her damn station. Enough, Eric said, his tone sharp enough to make both sides fall silent. He glanced at Keela. How about we review the logs and see who did what and when? That'll clear this up faster than arguing. Keela nodded. Agreed. They spent the next 20 minutes going over the cargo manifests and storage logs. As they worked, Eric noticed how easily he and Keela coordinated. They didn't need to discuss every step. One would pull up a file while the other cross-checked it against the inventory. When they finally pieced everything together, it turned out the dispute had stemmed from a miscommunication rather than deliberate sabotage. All right, Eric said, turning to the gathered crew. Here's the deal. The Atriarch crew had a valid safety concern, but the human crew should have been informed before any containers were moved. Going forward, let's make sure both sides are notified before adjustments are made. Understood. There were a few grumbles, but eventually both Harris and Loren nodded. Good, Eric said. Now let's get this place back in order. As the crew dispersed, Eric turned to Keela. Well, that could have gone worse. It could have, she agreed. But it went as well as could be expected, given the circumstances. Eric rubbed the back of his neck. You'd think after a year of peace, people would have figured out how to get along. Old habits die hard, Keela said. But progress is progress, no matter how small. Fair enough, Eric said. He glanced at her, a small smile playing at his lips. You handled that pretty well, Captain. Ever consider a career in diplomacy? Keela tilted her head. I doubt I would excel in such a role. Diplomacy requires a softer touch than I am accustomed to. I don't know, Eric said. You're pretty good at cutting through the noise. I'd say that's a valuable skill. Her expression softened. Thank you, Major. Perhaps you have a talent for diplomacy as well. You managed to diffuse that argument without assigning blame. Rick couldn't help but feel a growing respect for Keela. She wasn't just efficient, she was steady, thoughtful, and willing to engage with a former enemy in a way that most wouldn't. Well, Eric said, breaking the silence. If you ever need a break from all this progress, let me know. I can introduce you to another Earth film. Maybe something more serious this time. Keela's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I will keep that in mind. As they walked out of the cargo bay together, Eric realized that, despite the lingering tensions, something was shifting. They were no longer just 2 officers on opposite sides of a long-closed conflict. They were something else entirely, partners in the delicate work of moving forward. The station was quieter than usual. Most of the crew had already turned in for the night, leaving only a handful of people wandering the corridors. Eric made his way toward the observation deck, a hot drink in hand. The stillness didn't bother him, he'd grown used to it over the past year. What surprised him was the sound of footsteps trailing just behind him. Not heading to quarters yet, Major? Keela's voice carried a subtle note of curiosity. Eric glanced back to find her following, arms crossed but with no urgency in her stride. I could ask you the same thing, Captain. Let's just say I was curious about what draws you to the observation deck so often, she replied, her expression as calm and steady as ever. Eric smirked and turned his gaze forward. You'll see soon enough. When they arrived, the expansive window stretched before them, showcasing the vast emptiness of space. Stars shimmered faintly in the distance, their light undisturbed by the station's minimal glow. Eric leaned against the railing, sipping his drink, while Keela stood beside him, hands resting lightly on the cold metal. "So," she asked after a moment, "what's the attraction?" Eric gestured toward the view. "That? No matter what's happening in here, no matter the arguments, the mistakes, the past, that stays the same. It's constant. Quiet." Keela studied the stars, her eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something. Humans always seem fascinated by the stars. We saw them as functional, something to be navigated. But you look at them and find meaning. "I don't know if it's meaning exactly," Eric said, his tone contemplative. "Maybe it's just the reminder that we're a small piece of something much bigger. Makes our problems feel less overwhelming." "An interesting perspective," Keela replied. "And one that may hold truth." They stood in silence for a time, the weight of unspoken thoughts settling between them. Then Eric spoke, his voice quiet but deliberate. "Do you ever think about what comes next? I mean, after the station? After we've finished all this cooperation and gone back to our own worlds?" Keela didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the stars as if she were reading the future in their faint glow. "I don't know," she admitted. "Our leaders tell us that peace will last, that our peoples will learn to coexist. But I wonder how long it will take to rebuild trust." Eric nodded, his grip tightening slightly on the railing. "Yeah, I wonder that too. Seems like trust is harder to build than it is to break." She turned to look at him, her eyes catching the light from the stars. "You've worked toward it, though. I've seen it in how you handle disputes, how you treat my people. That effort does not go unnoticed." He met her gaze and smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you. Not everyone would have taken that first step, offering me a taste of Atriarch food, sharing parts of your culture. That's not exactly in the standard operations manual." Keela's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I thought it would be worth the risk." "And was it?" Eric asked, his tone light, but the question carried weight. "Yes," she said simply. "It was." The next day, Eric and Keela found themselves working on a project that tested the station's emergency response systems. It was meant to ensure that if another power fluctuation occurred, the crew could react swiftly and prevent further damage. The drills were routine, but this time, the human and Atriarch teams were paired together, a decision that stirred some grumbles on both sides. Eric stood at the center of the control room, watching as the teams gathered. Vaughn was there, along with Harris, the human crewman who had clashed with the Atriarch technician Loren weeks earlier. On the Atriarch side, Loren and her team were busy checking their equipment. The tension was palpable. "All right," Eric said, raising his voice enough to cut through the murmurs. "Today's drill is about coordination. That means we're going to work together. No finger-pointing, no arguing. Just focus on the tasks at hand." There were a few reluctant nods, but the atmosphere remained stiff. Keela stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We are here to ensure the station's safety. That goal transcends any lingering hostilities. Let us focus on the work." The Atriarch team straightened, their respect for her authority clear. Eric noticed how her words carried weight, how she commanded attention without raising her voice. He decided to follow her lead. "Good. Now, Harris, you'll work with Loren on the secondary power relays. Vaughn, take the diagnostic station with Rithel. The rest of you pair up with someone from the other team and start running the test sequences. Keep communication clear and concise." Harris hesitated, glancing at Loren with visible doubt. Loren met his gaze with a steady, almost challenging look. Eric stepped closer, speaking low enough that only the two of them could hear. "Harris, give it a chance," Eric said. "You might find you're better at this as a team." Harris grunted, but he nodded. "Fine." The teams dispersed, and Eric and Keela remained at the main console, overseeing the operation. As the drill progressed, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Tasks were completed, instructions were followed, and the expected friction didn't escalate into open conflict. Eric leaned toward Keela, keeping his voice low. "Looks like it's working." "It seems so," she said. "Though I suspect it has more to do with necessity than goodwill." "Necessity's a start," Eric replied. "Goodwill can come later." They exchanged a brief look, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them. By the time the drill ended, the atmosphere in the control room was noticeably lighter. Some of the human and Atriarch crew members were even exchanging nods of approval, if not outright smiles. Harris muttered something to Loren that sounded almost like a thanks, and Vaughn slapped Rithel on the back in a friendly gesture. "Well," Vaughn said, approaching Eric and Keela. "That went better than I expected. I think Harris might even be warming up to Loren." "Miracles do happen," Eric said with a smirk. Vaughn chuckled. Guess I owe you that drink after all, Major. Captain Rin, care to join us? Keela considered the offer, then shook her head. I appreciate the invitation, Lieutenant, but I must attend to my reports. Suit yourself, Vaughn said, heading off toward the mess hall. Eric lingered, looking at Keela. You know, you don't always have to be so formal. A drink with the crew wouldn't hurt. Perhaps, she said, her tone measured. But I believe it is more important to maintain a certain distance. It ensures that my authority remains intact. Fair enough, Eric said. But maybe next time you can make an exception. She tilted her head slightly. Perhaps. That evening Eric returned to the observation deck. He didn't expect Keela to follow this time, but as he stared out at the stars, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. When he turned, she was there, her expression as composed as ever. Couldn't stay away, huh? Eric said, a hint of teasing in his voice. I thought I might take you up on your earlier suggestion, Keela replied. To make an exception. Eric smiled, stepping aside so she could join him by the railing. They stood there, side by side, the vast expanse of space stretching before them. The silence wasn't awkward, it was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. I still don't understand how you find peace in staring at this, Keela said after a while. But perhaps I will learn. Maybe, Eric said. Or maybe you'll find your own reason to keep coming back. As they stood there, Eric felt a strange sense of contentment. The bridge they were building wasn't just professional, it was personal. And though the path ahead was still uncertain in that moment, it didn't matter. They were moving forward together. The station had its own rhythm. Days blended into each other, marked by the hum of machinery and the steady cycle of tasks. Eric had grown familiar with the routine. Morning checks, midday drills, evening briefings. It was predictable, even comforting in its own way. Yet, there were moments that still felt new, moments when something shifted, when connections deepened and unexpected partnerships began to form. Eric's daily routine now often included Keela, though he hadn't exactly planned it that way. They were constantly assigned to the same projects, tasked with resolving the inevitable conflicts that arose on a station housing former enemies. Over time, their interactions became more fluid. They spoke more openly, exchanged more than just the standard pleasantries. It wasn't just cooperation, it was a growing camaraderie, one that neither of them had expected. One afternoon, Eric and Keela stood in the station's control center, monitoring a scheduled engine test. The human and Atriarch teams were scattered around the room, each handling their assigned tasks. Eric sipped his lukewarm coffee, watching the numbers on the screen stabilize. Everything looks good so far, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Keela, standing beside him, nodded. The readings are within acceptable parameters. However, I'd suggest a secondary diagnostic after the test. The last report indicated slight fluctuations in the coolant flow. Eric glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. You sure do love your coolant checks. Thoroughness is never a flaw, Keela replied, her tone as even as always, though Eric thought he caught a hint of amusement in her expression. I'll give you that, he said, turning back to the console. All right, let's run the second sequence. Vaughn, start the Phase 2 ignition. Lieutenant Vaughn, stationed at a nearby terminal, gave a thumbs up. Got it, Major. Initiating now. The engine test hummed along without incident. Eric and Keela continued to monitor the screens, their movements and observations synchronized. They spoke occasionally, exchanging observations and minor adjustments, but otherwise worked in comfortable silence. The other crew members had started to notice the ease with which the two officers communicated. There were no barked orders, no sharp disagreements, just a steady, quiet understanding. Later that evening, Eric found Keela in the station's rec room. She sat at a small table, a datapad in hand. Eric approached, holding 2 cups of what passed for tea on the station. He set one down in front of her before taking a seat across from her. Thought you might want something warm, he said. Keela looked at the cup, then at him. Thank you, Major. Eric, he corrected gently. I think we're past titles at this point. Her expression remained unreadable, but she inclined her head slightly. Eric. He took a sip of his tea, letting the silence settle between them. The rec room was nearly empty, save for a few crew members quietly playing cards at another table. Eric watched as Keela set her datapad aside and took a small sip from her cup. Not bad, huh, he said. It is tolerable, she replied. Better than the station's coffee, at least. Eric chuckled. I'll take that as a win. They sat quietly for a moment before Eric spoke again. You've been here a while now. What do you think of the station, all things considered? It is functional, Keela said. Though it is not without its challenges. The integration of our teams has been a learning experience. That's one way to put it, Eric said with a grin. But you've handled it well. Better than most would in your position. Keela met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. I could say the same about you. Many in your place would have allowed old grievances to cloud their judgment. I've had my moments, Eric admitted. But at the end of the day, we're all stuck on this station together. Might as well make it work. Kilo's lips curved slightly, though not quite into a full smile. A practical perspective. One that I can respect. They finished their tea in companionable silence, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing day. The next morning, Eric and Kilo were assigned to oversee a supply delivery from a nearby outpost. The shipment was crucial, containing replacement parts for the station's aging systems. When the cargo ship docked, Eric and Kilo were there to greet it. The crew of the cargo ship, a mix of humans and Atriarch, looked wary as they disembarked. It was clear they weren't used to seeing their former enemies working side by side. Eric noticed their hesitation and decided to address it head-on. "Welcome to Etra Station," he said, his tone calm but firm. "We're here to make sure the transfer goes smoothly. If you have any concerns, speak up now." There was a brief, awkward silence before one of the cargo crew, a young human, stepped forward. "It's just strange seeing humans and Atriarch working together like this. We've heard stories, but..." "It's not as strange as it sounds," Eric said. "We've been doing this for a while now and it works. You'll see." Keela added, "You may find that cooperation is more efficient than conflict." The young crewman nodded slowly and the tension began to ease. The cargo transfer went smoothly, with Eric and Keela overseeing the process and ensuring that every crate was accounted for. By the time the last container was unloaded, the cargo crew seemed more at ease. They even exchanged a few friendly words with the station's staff before departing. As the cargo ship pulled away, Eric turned to Keela. "Not bad. Looks like we're getting the hang of this whole working together thing." "It appears so," Keela said. "Though I suspect there will always be challenges." "Challenges keep things interesting," Eric said. "Besides, I'd rather deal with these challenges than the ones we faced during the war." "Agreed," Keela said quietly. They stood there for a moment, watching the cargo ship disappear into the void. Though the station remained, as always, a place of tension and uncertainty, Eric felt that they had taken another small step forward. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was progress. And that for now was enough.